Hello and welcome everyone to the Pahl and Rowsell Artifactual Literacies Museum. My name is Randall Wolf and I will be your virtual guide to this virtual tour of our special exhibit, Beowulf and Artifacts as Translation of Identity. Alright, and to those of you who this is your first time here, some background information I think is necessary. The first question we usually get being, what makes something an artifact? I like to think of what makes something an artifact simply as the objects that spark a story as soon as you pick them up. You know, the one that you lift up and you're almost physically transported to an experience you had with that. But Pahl and Rowsell have a checklist of things that make something an artifact. A few things to help you get thinking about what is and is not an artifact. An artifact has physical features that make it distinct. It is created, found, carried, put on display, hidden, evoked in language, or worn. So it has a wide variety of things, not just things you find in museums like ours, but things you find in your house, things that you wear every day, like a particular watch you got from your grandfather, or a poster you put on your wall from a particular point in your life. It embodies people, stories, thoughts, communities, identities, and experiences. And it is valued or made by a meaning maker in a particular context. And for this exhibit, we'll be looking at the Seamus Heaney translation of Beowulf for examples of how it itself is an artifact and how artifacts within the story help bring the characters to life. All right, and now some information that is pertinent to our special exhibit. The question of what are identities? Now, it's important that we know that we're not asking what is identity, but identities, plural. We believe here that we all have multiple identities, and those identities are determined by context, where we are, who we're engaging with. We use different identities. So the definition we use putting together this special exhibit were identities are narratives, stories people tell themselves and others about who they are and who they are not. We'll talk a little bit about that, who we are not, in relation to Beowulf and Unferth when we talk about the sword shared by Unferth to Beowulf. Importantly, artifacts and identities are intertwined. Now, when we say identities are narratives, in a sense, identities are these experiences that we think define us, that we tell stories about, and we store those identities in objects as reminders, as sparks of inspiration, as symbols we show to other people to represent who we are, or who we are not. Here is our first artifact in our exhibit, our special exhibit on Beowulf, the Seamus Heaney translation of Beowulf. We include translations of texts as artifacts because of what Pahl and Rowsell have said. Meaning makers infuse the text they write with their identities and passions. This is an important thing to look at, even though he is telling a story that was written thousands of years before he got to it and has been translated into English several times before in many different iterations. He infused it with his own identity and passions. The words he chose that take the reader out of the story, that shake them from the habitus, their everyday life, their everyday language that they're using, and force them to wrestle with the foreignness of the concepts, or when he infuses from the foreignness, his own idioms, his own everyday language to make the reader feel more at home. He's infusing his own purposes, his own identities, his own stories, and grafting them on to the story of Beowulf. We'll see more of this as we go along in the translations. Our next artifact in this exhibit is going to be an Anglo-Saxon helmet that we believe would be the same style Beowulf would have worn. And we include this in our section about wearing our stories with a passage from Beowulf that I think allows us to see Beowulf in a different light if we focus on the stories and identities intertwined with the artifacts that he's wearing. But before we get to that, I'd like to share a quote from Pahl and Rowsell's book, Artifactual Literacies. Identities reside on a sea of stuff and of experiences. Those experiences are intertwined with material culture. Material culture is portable and travels with us. Now, when we look at this passage from Beowulf, we can see the stories that Beowulf is carrying with him. Right here at the part in the epic poem, Beowulf is preparing himself to dive into Grendel's mother's cave. And we see Beowulf, when we read closely, as afraid. Beowulf got ready, donned his war gear, indifferent to death. His mighty hand-forged, fine-webbed mail would soon meet with the menace underwater. It would keep the bone cage of his body safe. No enemy's clasp could crush him in it. No vicious arm lock choke his life out. To guard his head he had a glittering helmet that was due to be muddied on the mere bottom and blurred in the upswirl. It was of beaten gold, princely handgear, hooped and hasped by a weaponsmith who had worked wonders in days gone by, and adorned it with boar shapes. Since then it had resisted every sword. Now, when we look at those lines, we see Beowulf indifferent to death. I see that when we look at the objects, this is the story he's telling himself who he is. This is him as a public speaker about to go on stage and telling him that he has done this 1,000 times before. He's looking at the nicks on the helmet from the swords that it has resisted every time. He's examining the craftsmanship of his chainmail and telling the story of how it was made and its strength. This is who he is. This is the idea of him that he needs to be right now. And I think we get that idea distinctly from looking at the objects. Looking at him, just by himself, we see a man putting on his clothes and diving in. We don't see that brief glint of the everyman in him, the bravery that comes from fear, the I am afraid of what I am about to do, but I must go through it anyway, so here is the story I'm going to tell myself. This helmet will keep me safe. It has always kept me safe. This chainmail is of the finest quality, and it will keep me safe. It has always kept me safe. And our next artifact is also going to look into this, but in a slightly different way. In part, it's going to be the story he tells himself, but also it's going to be the story of someone else, who he is not. Continuing from our previous artifact, we're working in the same scene, Beowulf just about to jump into the lake after Grendel's mother. He's put on his helmet and his chainmail and has told him the stories of both of those objects in order to muster more bravery to complete the action that he needs to do. There's also another object, the hunting sword, given to him by Unferth. Now, Unferth earlier in the poem had expressed doubt in Beowulf. He had challenged the narrative that Beowulf tells himself and others. He had challenged Beowulf's identity. And in this passage, Unferth lends Beowulf a valuable sword, valuable both in its craftsmanship and its worth as an object, but also in its value of history, identity, and story. At that moment was of no small importance. The Brehon handed him a hilted weapon, a rare and ancient sword named Hrunting. The iron blade was its ill-boding patterns, had been tempered in blood. It had never failed the hand of anyone who hefted it in battle. Anyone who had fought and faced the worst in the gap of danger. This was not the first time it had been called to perform heroic feats. This continues on the idea of Beowulf calming his fears with the stories of an object. This sword had never failed anyone before. Why would it fail me now? This gives him the boost he needs to dive into certain danger. Dive into the gap of danger, to use Heaney's translation there, the way he uses a very foreign syntax and very common words to keep us both close and at arm's length, just as Beowulf is doing with the story here. He is keeping those around him at arm's length by projecting his bravado and identity, but he's also allowing them close by accepting this sword, by accepting the forgiveness of Unferth. Now, looking at the next stanza, when he lent that blade to the better swordsman, Unferth, the strong-built son of Iglaf, could hardly have remembered the ranting speech he had made in his cups. He was not man enough to face the turmoil of a fight underwater and the risk to his life. So there he lost fame and repute. It was different for the other, rigged out in his gear, ready to battle. This is an interesting identity here because it is that other part. It's the story we tell us of who we're not. Beowulf is accepting the sword from Unferth, but at the same time saying, I am not Unferth. I am Beowulf. I am the better swordsman. I am the one rigged out in the gear. I am the one ready for this challenge. So Beowulf, in these scenes, dons the identity that he needs to be, takes the pieces of identity he needs from others, and denies the identity that he does not want. He is meeting the field of battle with his everyday life, and he is in that doxa. He is creating his own version of the identity, what we would call a translation of identity. It is not a transcription of identity, but a translation. It's not an exact copy. It takes your habitus, your everyday, and improvises it with the situation at hand to create something new, a new artifact or a new story, a new identity within an artifact. Moving to the end of the epic poem Beowulf and the end of our virtual tour here for the last piece of this exhibit, we want to look at the idea of artifacts as a translation of identity. We've talked a lot about how they store our ideas within them, our narratives of who we are, our identities of ourselves, what we choose to wear, what we lend to others, how we distance ourselves from identities that we do not want to be a part of. This scene that we want to look at here to examine the idea of a translation of identity comes between a dying Beowulf after his last heroic feat to kill a dragon ravaging his home, and Wingloff, the young thane who stood by him when the others ran away. Beowulf has just asked his final favor to be shown the treasure that he died in order to get, not in a greedy sense, but a final representation of his accomplishments. A visualization of his identity as a great, wealthy, worthy king. So having no heirs, we come to this idea of improvisation. When a generation doesn't have the tools to handle the situation at hand, they must improvise based on their habitus and what they know. And this will become their new everyday. Beowulf doesn't have an heir, so he improvises an heir in Wingloff. Then the king, in his great-heartedness, unclasped the collar of gold from his neck and gave it to the young thane, telling him to use it and the war shirt and the gilded helmet well. This is where we get to the idea of translation. These objects are storied with the identity of Beowulf. And every time Wingloff wears or uses these artifacts, they're going to have Beowulf's identity in them, but not exactly. Not a carbon copy or a transcription. It is not like Donald Blake from the Thor comics picking up Mjolnir and becoming literally Thor. This is Wingloff's interpretation of Beowulf and what Beowulf would want. It is him viewing Beowulf through his own life. It is Wingloff's idea, his own narrative of Beowulf. Just like this translation of Beowulf is not the original Beowulf. Not to say that Seamus Heaney didn't do a faithful and accurate job translating the text, but it is infused with Seamus Heaney's ideas of Beowulf. The words he felt would convey the messages and passions of Beowulf, the ideas of lineage and religion, manliness and courage, the words that he felt would keep the audience close and the ones that would take them off balance, the structure that he wanted to hold on to in the Anglo-Saxon text, that two stressed syllables on either side of a line instead of opting for an iambic pentameter or prose. These are all things that were choices Heaney made with the text of Beowulf. Just like with the objects and responsibilities given to Wingloff, there are going to be decisions made based on his interpretation of Beowulf. And that's what we mean by artifacts are a translation of identity. They're not a transfer of identity. They are not a transcript of identity. They are a translation. You come to the object with your own identity and you infuse it with the stories that others have put on that object. So when we look at objects having history, what we're really saying is they have lived lives. They've had identities given to them. Each person who adds a story to it changes that object. Where if an object is passed down from father to son to grandson to great-grandson, each life that object has changes. And it is always a translation. The details of the stories change. We highlight the heroic aspects of our ancestors in a way that allows us to highlight the things we wish we were, to tell the stories of who we are, and to tell the stories of who we are not. Maybe we have artifacts of relatives that we're not proud of, that we still keep. A way to say, I'm not this. Just as with the ending of Beowulf, the end of the poem, Wingloff will have to decide who he is, where he wants the qualities of Beowulf, and when he does not. And with that, thank you for joining us at the Pahl and Rowsell Artifactual Literacies Museum. Please come see us again when we have a exhibit on the Christopher Logue account of the Iliad war music. Thank you.